Okay, we are now streaming live. So, Doris, are you beginning?
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you. Tonight we have a presentation and discussion by the Borough President's Office on health disparities,
Comprehensive plan, yes, to address health disparity.
to address health disparities in our borough. So I will turn it over to Josephine and the Borough President's Office to begin the presentation.
Yeah, so just to say for the record, it's a joint committee meeting with zoning and land use. And Doris Cruz is chair, and chair of the Senior Issues Housing, Health and Welfare Committee is Jana Toby. Jana is here this evening as well. And now I think we could jump right into the presentation. John, you should be able to share.
You all see that?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So yes, thanks again for having us. This is a ongoing project. It's certainly not final, so we're excited to sort of have this discussion with you and make sure we're on the right track and look for opportunities to work together. So health and housing for Brooklyn's comprehensive plan is the focus. Just a really simple definition of comp plan is that it's, a document that provides guidance for stakeholders to use a lot of means to achieve its goals. And for this plan in particular, the borough president wanted to do this. It's a campaign promise, but also wanted to make sure that this process can be data driven and community guided, and that though after that feedback and that data input, he will be able to make more informed decisions during ULURP and other discretionary approvals he has. Another major thing he likes to, is accountability. And so he wants people to hold him accountable to this plan. And then want to share critical data that we found, and just want to make sure folks know what kind of resources are available to them, and that it can be sort of a clearinghouse for information. So what this plan is not, which I think is, people throw around the word comprehensive plan. So I just want to make sure we're, at least limiting somewhat. So this is not a citywide comprehensive plan. This is not, the borough president feels like there should be a citywide strategy. And so this is not to take the place of that. It's just an opportunity to demonstrate the value of it. This is not a substitute for ongoing local planning efforts. So we've met with a few other community boards so far, and they've highlighted some of the work they've done, like the Bushwick Community Plan and the Grid and CB10 and the 197A plan in Williamsburg. So I know there's a lot of efforts that have been going on before this process, and we want to make sure that we're documenting them, making sure that if there are efforts that you all want to be highlighted, that we, make sure that we incorporate that. So we're not trying, this process wouldn't replace local efforts, and it's not complete, like I said. So we're coming to you with these sort of draft ideas. And then it's not a rezoning. So the borough president is not planning to submit a rezoning application, but it certainly is a framework for how we think about development. So just a brief overview of the borough president's powers and responsibilities. As you know, he can, write recommendations for ULURP, sponsor legislation at city council. He has a budget that he can allocate and monitor and modify delivery of public services that, are not sufficient. And then convening a wide group of stakeholders to come up with a strategic plan for the future of Brooklyn. So why focus on health and housing? The map on the right shows the discrepancies and the disparities in life expectancy. So the darker the color, the lower the life expectancy. And as you can see, the darker shading is really concentrated in eastern portion of the borough. And so we're hoping that through health and housing, focusing on the values that housing provides for improving public health outcomes, that we can use that as a shared framework for how we want to see the future of Brooklyn grow. And just there's a lot of research that's showing that the location of housing, how close it is to transit, and how connected you are to job centers is a really key. Those are the three key determinants of how the physical environment can affect life expectancy and other health conditions. So there's been a lot more research about showing that connection between the physical environment and the public health. Up to date, so we published the existing conditions report last December. It was a joint effort between Regional Planning Association, which is a regional planning agency or a nonprofit in New York metro area. New York Academy of Medicine has been sort of our research partner on the data side for pulling public health information. And so we basically pulled together everything in terms of what we felt were relevant, existing condition status, everything from where flooding occurs today, like during daylight flooding, and then up to, income and, just so much open space, all of it. So feel free, if you haven't, please take a look. It's just sort of an atlas of data with a lot of different indicators, is just to show how diverse and how dynamic our borough is. Held a town hall in December to get some feedback from the public on some of the existing conditions research, and then we also had an online portal for folks to comment on those existing conditions data points to say, this doesn't resonate with me, or I know this block and it doesn't really make sense to see this information. We got a lot of feedback actually over the last year, and so our team is incorporating a lot of that feedback. So this document, the existing conditions report, will be updated with that feedback in mind when the final report comes out with all the recommendations this summer, hopefully in June. We present to the borough board, which you all know about, and the borough service cabinet, which is where all the agencies come and report to the borough president about ongoing work. And so we want to use that opportunity to bring the agencies together at a shared vision and try to find opportunities for cross collaboration between those agencies. And then engaging with critical stakeholders. Borough president is meeting with a lot of people every single day talking about this plan. And we just brought in Hester Street, which is a nonprofit that specializes in community engagement, to help lead some more targeted outreach efforts. So they may be reaching out to you or someone very soon. This is just some images from that event. So out of the existing conditions work, we've been working pretty hard this last few months, just trying to come up with a path forward. So as the recommendations are folding, we're basically organizing this plan, just simple, goals, objectives, recommendations, and metrics. So, our goals are big picture, objectives sort of solve a problem, and recommendations or highlight an issue to solve, and recommendations are a solution. And then our metrics we think are really important. It's how we measure success and what data point we're using to measure success. And then, so in tandem with this sort of list of goals, and we developed a few sort of what do we call it? Not abstract, but theoretical land use frameworks that show sort of the spatial distribution of how to prioritize which recommendations are have the most impact and where. So this is the goals that we've sort of highlighted and sort of feel encompass everything basically around planning, which is, we want to reduce environmental hazard exposure to everyone, but in particular vulnerable populations, increasing access to affordable healthcare and housing, active living, supporting community-based organizations that are helping and doing work in some of those communities with major health disparities, increasing access to jobs, and incorporating accessibility in every project we do. This is an example of one goal and one objective and how it's sort of organized. So every goal on the previous page has multiple objectives under it, multiple recommendations, and maybe a few metrics depending on what data we're looking at. So for example, we want to reduce hazardous environmental conditions for vulnerable populations. The map on the right is, for example, a map of heat stress vulnerable populations. So the higher the concentration of folks that are, elderly, very young, asthmatic, those are sort of the types of populations that are most susceptible to, having to be hospitalized from heat stress. So looking at expanding tree cover, making sure we have cool roofs, making sure we have access to air conditioning. So as the borough president talks about recommendations, if a ULURP comes up, or talking about budgeting and talking about how do we help solve challenges around heat, we know what the most affected populations are and where the most bang for our buck can be. And then just the metric there is reducing the amount of heat that those vulnerable populations are exposed to. Spatial planning, so that was an example. Like I said, every one of those goals has a separate list of objectives and everything. So now this is the 4 frameworks that we've come up with that kind of help highlight some of the major opportunities for the future of Brooklyn, and want to talk through it with you. And once again, these are all sort of conceptual in nature, but it's sort of focused on where housing and growth is appropriate. How do we manage that parking? How do we create an economy that's focused on health and wellness, where those disparities in health exist? Making sure we have safe streets and clean environment, and then the resilient infrastructure jobs. So I'll go through some of them. This is just an example of showing that the first page that showed all the goals and objectives and recommendations, they can solve multiple objectives for the land use frameworks, and vice versa. So they're not mutually exclusive. Some of these recommendations may solve multiple problems. So for example, we're looking at housing growth and parking demand management. This map was probably needs some updating now because of recent conversations at the state level, that this was kind of looking at where, based on the state budget conversation around housing, those areas that had 50 units per acre or less. And so, we've seen a lot of growth in North Brooklyn, not so much in South Brooklyn. And so in terms of density along transit, it's less dense in South Brooklyn than North Brooklyn. So we think that there's a rationale for why we think growth should be encouraged in this area. One based on fair share, another on transit-oriented development principles, and then trying to reduce traffic. So housing growth, like I said, we've seen a significant development in North Brooklyn, definitely some development in South Brooklyn as well, in particular Coney Island and Bath Beach and Bensonhurst, but less so in some of the other areas that are still transit accessible. And in terms of where we want to see growth, we want to make sure that it's based on sound planning principles. So we're looking for more dense development near transit, and the further you go away, the less dense we think it should be. So within a quarter mile, you're really looking at trying to get as much as much density as the community can stomach around the transit stops, and then within that half mile, looking at opportunities for infrastructure investments, for like open space schools, those kind of things, infrastructure, sewer infrastructure. And then beyond that half mile, probably a lot of CB10 is, we're not really looking for major upzonings. We're looking for sort of smaller interventions, accessory dwelling units, opportunities that increase the housing stock, but don't necessarily change the neighborhood character. And so we've been working with Brooklyn AIA, Architects Institute of America, and so a couple other groups trying to sort of come up with some prototypes of how, different communities, if it's an attached row house, how do you get the second unit in that, on that site, or is it a detached single family or whatever, duplex? What are the best practices based on sort of that neighborhood character to add the unit that doesn't create as much disruption, at least visually? And so we think that density is appropriate depending on how close you are to subway or public transit. So on the other side of housing growth, clearly we need parking management strategies, and big picture, the borough president, feels that we're not going to create any new on-street parking. And so we want to encourage folks to take mass transit, but it has to be a convenient alternative for folks. And one of the best ways to make it convenient is to concentrate development closest to those subway stations. These are just best practices around parking demand management. So it's not just one strategy on, in terms of how we manage parking. It's a whole suite of issues. And it's basically focused on trying to reduce the amount of trips rather than the number of cars, which is a whole nother sort of paradigm in terms of how we think about impacts. But parking cash out is an opportunity to, there's a federal subsidy for folks who commute and get a parking space at work. How can we make it so that people can cash out that money and use it for other needs? And if they decide that they would rather forego the parking spot, take transit if they can, and get that extra income. Wayfinding is different tools. Right now, the Lyft app actually is probably one of the better ones. It shows you where all the off-street parking exists, and how much it costs when it's open, what's the utilization. Those are all really important for folks who don't necessarily live in the community, who just want to find a parking space. They might be willing to just pay for it. And then there's other strategies. I think we've heard actually some positive feedback about residential parking permits, which has been floated at the state level as well. Happy to hear your thoughts about that. And then just some other strategies, including reducing minimums that are closest, parking minimums that are closest to transit, and overflow parking when we know there's a large venue that has a lot of traffic, that they are properly staffing and managing traffic flows. The second sort of framework is looking at health and wellness economy. We're focused on creating better health outcomes, reducing barriers to care, and stronger community services. The map on the right shows areas in orange that are the highest concentration of health disparities, focused on life expectancy as a measure there. And then in blue, we see a significant population of concentration of our education and healthcare workers. Like I said, we want to focus on delivering more improved healthcare services, access to community services, and reducing barriers to that service. This is the map of the concentration of healthcare and education workers. The darker the color, the higher the concentration. So you can see in like CB10, you have a significant portion of population that lives in this area that isn't necessarily, transit is not very accessible. The orange line, the route on top, is the proposed IBX line, which is the state sort of led project with CSX that owns that freight line to introduce passenger rail there. And so it opens up at least opportunities for folks to get onto transit that are currently not close to transit. And so we think it's a good opportunity to reduce the number of car trips in the community. Healthy streets and environment, really focused on Vision Zero. As you know, traffic accidents are increasing, and that's not a good sign. So we want to focus on interventions that make safe streets. I think that's going to be maybe different than we all thought, with introduction of new different types of scooters and everything. And so trying to rationalize how we all these different users can use the street is a huge challenge, but using capital projects that are already slated to help sort of solve those problems. And Flatbush Avenue, the mayor's office has sort of highlighted as one of their major efforts. And yeah, I think, and then the red portion of the map is where air quality is particularly bad. And go into that next slide. So this is a map of the concentration of PM 2.5 pollution. So the darker the color, the higher the concentration of PM 2.5 pollutants. That's basically just particulate matter, just dust or whatever that is the size that can actually affect human health. So that's one of the ways that we measure air quality. And it exacerbates folks' asthma, and it's a sort of a big picture understanding of how polluted the air is. And as we see, it's really concentrated in our industrial areas and along the BQE. And these are also a map of all the Superfund sites, the open storage of chemicals, and Superfund and toxic waste sites, and peaker plants. And the last one is resilient infrastructure and jobs. This is focused on sort of the rail portion of the IBX, the existing freight movements. That creates an opportunity for the cross harbor tunnel from Jersey to get more trucks off the road, so they're not having to use the Verrazano and the BQE to move freight. So we have potential to remove a lot of truck traffic out of Brooklyn, just moving things to rail and marine-based transfers. And so, and the IBX line right now can connect all the way up to Queens. So we have an opportunity to move the freight that, you know, let's say is just passing through Brooklyn, keeping it off our streets can have a really big effect on reducing congestion. And then we've been speaking with a lot of folks in the like NYSERDA and other folks about in our EDC and other agencies about wind energy. And everyone feels strongly that wind energy is the competitive advantage of New York State. The shelf out in the water off Montauk is very shallow, which apparently makes wind turbines very cheap cheaper to install than floating wind turbines. And so we have that advantage. And so we want to make sure that we're maximizing that opportunity. And at our industrial waterfront, we have, you know, very large industrial waterfront that has, you know, was really built out of World War II and the war effort there. And so how do we reinvigorate those spaces with high quality jobs that don't necessarily require a significant amount of higher education? And then, like I said, we want to support multimodal freight. And then the Army Corps project, I'm sure you all have heard of it. I think Bay Ridge is a little less affected, but certainly is a major infrastructure project to help protect a lot of Brooklyn communities. It's a once in a generation investment in our resilient waterfront. You know, I think there's been a lot of concerns about the types of interventions they're proposing, and it sounds like they're willing to work with us. So the borough president has been trying to sort of make sure that this project is, you know, isn't coming up on unexpected bumps that could be prevented. So I think the major issue we're concerned about is the gates construction around the canals and creeks that are also Superfund sites. And so we are not sure that, you know, we want to know what the timeline is for completing the Superfund site and the gate installation. And then there's some issues with elevation and Newtown Creek, but that's very far away from you all. Just last thing, IBX we think solves a lot of issues, encourages active living, reduces commute times, car traffic, air quality, and access to opportunity. This map on the right shows the darker the color, the higher the concentration in the number of vehicles miles traveled. So that's number of basically trips you're taking with the car, not necessarily how many cars are in that community. So we see a lot more activity along further south you go, the further from transit you go, more car trips. That makes sense. So with the proposed blue, that's the IBX line, there is an opportunity to get folks or people are already living in these areas closer to transit, and hopefully reduce the number of trips they're taking to improve our environment. And then just, in terms of transit-oriented development, it does make sense that there would be a little bit more density proposed along the IBX route. And then opportunities to make sure, you know, that when one train line fails, which is inevitable, that people have access to all the different rails that serve South Brooklyn. And then just that connection between waterborne and rail freight movements. This is the planning process so far. We are really keeping conversations with you all at this point. And we just met with the advisory committee that I spoke about at the top, and walked through some of the recommendations that you'll see on the survey. And so we'll have the town hall public workshop on May 18th. And we have the digital survey, which is linked here, and you all I will send it to you. And I think that's it for me. So happy to take any questions or discuss any issues.
Great. Doris, you're on mute. Doris, you're on mute.
An excellent presentation, thank you. But I have 3 questions. One, your first slide, and it was also slide 20, which showed the age thing. And there's a strange swath in the middle of Community Board 10. And I don't want you to answer it now, but could you send us the data on that? Because it seems odd. I would have expected to see dots in and around the community, but not a swath. And
there is one big, I think it's Fort Hamilton down there. And I think
no, it's not Fort Hamilton. It goes from the shore. I live in Fort Hamilton, so I know it.
Okay.
But there's a swath that basically goes through the middle of Bay Ridge. It's right there.
Yep.
Could you just send us the data on that, or the data for the board, so we can have a better understanding?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because that's too much for me to absorb now. And my second question is, you mentioned accessory housing.
Yes.
Define accessory housing.
Basically, it's one additional unit. South Brooklyn, most of Brooklyn is zoned for multifamily. And so, but a lot of land use, so the actual what's built there is single family homes. And so if there is a single family sort of context, what kind of strategies can we use to potentially allow for homeowners to have passive income with a second unit on their site, but it doesn't necessarily detract from the nature or the neighborhood character of the visual feel. And so that's why
Dean, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, a couple of comments and then I have a question. I think I actually read through the report when I received it from the community board. I think it's excellent. It's extremely comprehensive. However, the one, if we had to say one single thing that would help all people across the board, would be an increase in the minimum wage. Because as your income increases, your health disparities decrease, everything goes in the opposite direction. So I think I know it's controversial, I know all the difficulties, I get all of that, but in terms of lower income families, in terms of wages, that is the single most important thing, and it helps the families the most. The more their basic wages, the less they have to depend on everybody else. So I think that's extremely important. It should be, part of the conversation. Maybe the borough president doesn't want to include it in this because I understand it would be controversial, but I think that is the single biggest thing we could do. The other thing, which is also, this is being discussed, would be legalizing basement apartments. And I think there would have to be some kind of mechanism to look at them for safety reasons. But there is a conversation going on about that. And the third item is an increase in very local medical facilities, preferably ones that are operated by hospitals. That brings, the medical facilities closer to people, again, making it easier for them. And now my question is, with and I get it, things move slow, I understand. What is the status with IBX? This has been a conversation for not months, years, multiple years. And so far, I really haven't heard anything more concrete than I heard 5 years ago. So what is the status with IBX? And if you want to comment on anything else I said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're spot on a lot of the things you just said. And from what I've heard from the BP is that, there's certain costs to construction that, it's just, this is how much it costs to build. And, eventually we do have to start talking about wages and what's actually just the affordability of construction and how to actually rent it. And so I think, eventually we're not going to necessarily be able to build our way out of it. And I think we'll have to have that conversation around income. I don't think he's afraid of having that in the plan. We haven't discussed it, but I think you're right to bring it up. And so I will elevate it for him. What was the second point you said?
The basement apartments.
Yes. So basement, yes. I think what we've seen is that I think there's a state law around the height of the apartments that is what I think the sort of wonks have figured out is one of the bigger challenges of legalizing those units. So there's unfortunately another state problem we have there. But I think you're right. I think basements absolutely, especially when people are already living in them in unsafe conditions, if we can legalize them and get them safe conditions, that'd be great. I think the other challenge there is just that it is very intensive in terms of resources to sometimes do some of the repairs that are needed for those. But absolutely. And then interborough. Well, no, you have one more. What was the last one?
About having local medical facilities within the communities, preferably sponsored by hospitals.
Yeah, I think I don't know if there are a lot of are there hospitals that do operate any in your area?
Yeah, they have I'm going to say branch sites, whether it's NYU Langone or Maimonides. They occasionally do have smaller sites within the communities. At least that's what I believe that anyway. Joseph, you can fill us in more.
So I think we're totally in agreement on that as well. And that's another way we can reduce, trips, because if people can just walk to their, their doc's appointment, that'd be even better. So we do want to sort of look at the data and see what conditions are most challenging in each community. And if they're happy to look at what facilities would do the most for Bay Ridge area and Dyker Heights. And we have been, one of the recommendations is to sort of encourage, if there is new growth, that they speak with hospital providers or healthcare and organizations to help site those in their ground floors. And so the borough president can help if there are projects or developments that you come across, and some of those there is a ground floor that's unspoken for. We're happy to be that partner to help bring them to the table. And then finally, for the IBX, I just sent you the final report that came out right as Hochul was elected. And this is basically it so far. They came out with a sort of a feasibility study and chose the alignment, which I think they've chosen is light rail. But it's definitely been a long time, and I'm sure there's more years of work to go on it. But if we can get it spearheaded, I think we're just making sure that nothing precludes it. And that's kind of what we're at right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. John, if I may, I just want to go over a couple of points really quickly. Many of the members here tonight and some who have not been members of either committee may not be aware that this board, through its zoning and land use committee, has looked at and has put together with fellows over the years some planning documents to really look at soft sites as of right development. While a big portion of our housing stock is 1 and 2 family homes, many are surprised that the majority are rentals and are apartment dwellings within Community Board 10. And some of the conversations that we've had in looking at our illegal conversion issues and some of our corridors that were prior manufacturing uses is that we do have a lot of as of right development. And how do we keep up with development without facing what our existing needs are? And that's really a challenge, and a lot was not mentioned in your report. I mean, for example, just in Board 10, we have one of the 5 wastewater treatment facilities, which, absorbs a catchment area of 5 community districts. Our infrastructure is aging. Our loads are increasing throughout Brooklyn. And as we increase density or increase development, whether it's as of right or future planning, We're having real issues in Board 10 in certain portions of our district that are experiencing sewage backups. As stormwater and climates, do change, our CSOs along the shore are impacted, and there doesn't really seem to be funding. And there's a great concern there. Board 10 also has the darkest blue in your existing conditions report for school seats for K-5. We have the greatest school seat deficit for K-5 seats in the Dyker Heights portion of our district, greatest in the city. We have many as of right developments that are happening now. We have a lot of illegal parking complaints. It's number one in the district. Parking is a concern that's raised by our commercial corridors. There was a district needs assessment done by our commercial corridor, businesses. And, sometimes there's unintended consequences when we look at development and the reduction of parking, like illegal front yard parking, and that impacts our resiliency. So all of these,
Yes.
existing needs and conditions really need to be, I think, looked at further and studied more. While we have a transit corridor along 4th Avenue, it's also an alternative route to the BQE. We have truck traffic issues. We have lots of 53 plus trucks, that are riding our streets that are bypassing from Central and North Brooklyn to the Verrazano Bridge and using our streets. And there's a result to that. So I think adding that conversation, I think, is important, because these are real strong issues that we've been concerned about over the years as both as district staff and as board members. And we've had planning fellows that have really looked at this. And I think we need to, that has to be part of any planning document to understand when we have goals, and looking at how we proceed, that we look at the existing conditions and some of our infrastructure needs as well.
Absolutely. I think I'm 100% on board with that in terms of we know that the infrastructure in New York is old and aging, and that we've seen a lot of development that has not been accounted for, let's say. And like you said, illegal conversions, those aren't, captured in the data that that is actually impacting our sewer infrastructure. I know that there's an issue around 10th Ave, south of 77th Street. I would love to hear more about that in your conversations.
You're right. I mean, I have data now. We're actually working on a survey. We have it on 10th Avenue. We have it along Shore Road. We had a meeting about an heirs development, and we heard from, I have correspondence now from 100 residents who have experienced sewage backups in both heavy rain events and in dry weather. We have CSOs that are along the shore where we have seen the deterioration post Sandy. And again, our Owl's Head wastewater treatment facility was built in the 1950s, and it's the catchment area for 5 community districts. I mean, it is a very large catchment area. And as we grow, not only in Board 10, but in our surroundings, all of that wastewater is funneled through an aging sewer system. And we strongly feel that we have conveyance problems now. And we've expressed that. Our council member has had meetings, high level meetings with DEP. We are very concerned about our conveyance system and our role. There's only 14 wastewater treatment plants in New York City, and we have one of them that captures 5 community districts. So it is a concern. It's a plant that needs lots of work. On one of your grids, I saw some of that heavy, deep red in terms of pollution right in that area where we have the IBX, the trains, the BQE, the Owl's Head treatment facility. So we need to speak about that and other things, but I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that our board has looked at over the years with planning fellows, as of right areas of growth. There's lots of new development that's taking place now, market rate development. Board 10 is one of the most affordable communities in the city of New York, and a lot of even the proposed affordable units exceed our market rate value. And we
Yep.
don't have a great transportation system, as you know, and as everyone here on this call does. But I wanted to make sure that as we begin talking about future planning, that we need to focus on our existing conditions that certainly impact us each day. And as we move forward in planning, they have to be part of that conversation.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think, previous, as controversial as the last mayor's version, he did set aside an infrastructure pot of money. And so I think we have to talk about growth and infrastructure together. And so happy to jump in on some of those conversations as the VP, if he can be helpful in moving those conversations along. We haven't been as much involved with the DEP conversation on 10th, but happy to help, like I said, on that issue. It sounds like they just built, halfway infrastructure and then just kind of gave up at the end. And so now we have drainage problems from that. So,
and it's part of a CSO or a combined sewer system, but it is aging. And that Shore Road section too of the board, which always has been a flooding problem, but now it's really exacerbated to homeowners who are experiencing, and not only homeowners, but large apartment buildings. We've heard from large apartment buildings along Shore Road that have terrible sewage backup problems. So
yeah, and if we could maybe reconnect on the planning fellow work that you all have done, and
yes.
If we could just chat about it. And I know that they are still, that effort, that fellowship is still running. And if you all wanted, I don't know if you participated last year.
Yes, we did, not this year, but we are participating next year. And we've had about 8 fellows, and we have 8 very good comprehensive reports that
I did my fellowship for CB6. So
oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I know they do good work. No, I was kidding.
And one of our fellows did the commercial district needs assessment for the Fifth Avenue Business Improvement District. So
okay. So yeah, we want to incorporate all that previous work, and so happy to talk about what the best way to communicate that to the public is.
Okay, great. We have Steve, and then Leo Dan, and then back to Doris. Steve, you're on mute.
Thank you. Okay, you go. John, I just want to tell you that I really appreciate what you did tonight. It was an excellent presentation, and I mean that seriously. It's something that we need more of. I'm interested in your perspective on parking. It's a very interesting situation. We obviously need housing, but the more housing you have, as it currently stands, it seems like almost every housing comes with a car. Right now, we do not have sufficient. In fact, you can't find a parking space in Bay Ridge. And I'm not advocating. I'm just trying to get a perspective as what happens. I remember one time, many years ago, when we were discussing this, and what people were. I actually heard some people say that it would be a great idea if we, for example, purchased 1 or 2 houses on every block, and then made parking. Right. That obviously makes no sense in view of what you're saying, about what we're creating housing. We have to create housing, all right? But again, housing comes with certain, parking being the perfect example of it, accoutrements, let's put it that way, that are required in order to support where they live. What is your perspective on cars in the city of New York, and what their future is, and how do you, and if they're included in the future, how do you provide for the parking? Because it's going to be a bigger and bigger problem as we go forward.
Absolutely, the city is growing, and like I think we try to say is that there's not more on-street parking that's being created, so we have to deal with what we have. I think we think that there is a pattern of growth that has shown that the closer to transit you are, the less trips you're taking, and the lower income you are, the less amount of cars that households on average own. So that has been the previous sort of planning paradigm around that, which is that you don't necessarily have to provide as much parking closer out of transit and to lower the income of the residents. That being said, this is New York. We have a lot of outstate drivers. You have the Verrazano Bridge. You have people from Jersey, Long Island, Westchester, everyone coming to park on our public streets. And so there's just not enough space. I think we're looking for on-street. I think my perspective on parking is that we want to unleash the private off-street parking market, create opportunities. I think there's some tweaks to the law that need to be made that allow for homeowners to rent out, if they don't own a car, that they can rent out their parking spot or for passive income and, get some of those cars off the street. There is some examples, Bay Street rezoning. I worked on that a while ago, and they came up with a special district text that allowed for off-street parking requirements to be satisfied off-site, but somewhere nearby. And so it's kind of what you're saying about sort of creating a parking garage with several different buildings funding that parking so that they don't necessarily have to provide it on-site, but they can have a better site off-site. So really wayfinding, really encouraging off-street, understanding the utilization off-street and getting folks to those off-street parking spots. And then we think the residential parking permits, I don't know how you guys feel about them, but at least we would be reserving the parking spaces for residents. And so hopefully that would also provide some level of assurances that at least residents would have available parking or better chance at getting parking depending on the program.
I do want to mention to you, it's a small piece, but the old Century 21 on 86th Street, that's a parking garage that's just laying there right now.
Sure.
Okay, how many parking spaces are there, Joe? Do you have any idea? Like 200, something like that?
Yeah, I could pull the file, but yes.
I'm just wondering. I'm just saying, with that kind of a thing, an opportunity like that arises, you should be aware of it. Okay,
Yes.
particularly since they're falling down in Manhattan. So, it'd be good if we were able to get some that are really in good condition like that. But I just wanted to hear your perspective on it, and I do greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think we're yes, and there's going to be a future for cars. I'm not sure what it'll look like, with EVs and everything, but people are going to take personal vehicles. That's just, we can't walk everywhere. It's just we can't walk to Mexico.
It's a tough problem. Like I said, if you bring people up in the world, you give them more income, then they are more likely to buy the car, and then the car, of course, is they got to go somewhere, and you want to shoot yourself.
Yeah,
how do you?
And the last thing is there's some talk about like incentivizing ride share programs so that like you have let's say you have an apartment building, you have a few spots for car share. Maybe that means that folks don't have to own a car and they can share that one car and take trips as needed. So I think there's a variety of tools that we can look at shared parking where like maybe residents can park in some of those commercial spaces at night as long as they clear out by a certain time, So I think there's a lot of creative things that we can do. Typically, sometimes developers will find their own sort of off-street parking solution somewhere else. Like in Queens, I worked a lot in Queens, and like all the restaurants will valet parking some other location park. But that maybe there's an opportunity for some businesses to cooperate in terms of managing some of that parking demand.
I'm glad that you've actually thought about it and that it's been well considered within there. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Next, we have Leah Dan Castillo.
Great, thank you. Thanks, John, and everyone that has been speaking tonight. Great presentation. I want to start by saying this has been a great presentation, looking at a really broad number of issues that I think, as we're discussing here tonight, a lot of these issues are completely connected and intertwined, right? So as we look into, as Justin was speaking about adding density or, making some of these changes that you're describing, looking at infrastructure and looking at, especially the aging infrastructure that we have here in our district is incredibly, in our communities, incredibly important. My one main question is pertaining to the zoning and density map that you've shown with the relation to the metro lines, and how you as part of the strategy to add density and obviously add density in a way that is tied to public transit to have a lesser kind of impact on the talking about parking, right? So that if you build closer to transit, you tend to rely less on automobiles, and you tend to bring people closer together to the job centers and whatnot. I want to ask, has there been any study for CB10 for the R line as to what this would mean in terms of density, additional density that will be added to our community?
I don't think the borough president is coming from a prescriptive sort of like we know where density makes sense in your community. Like we met with CB7 and we were like, we think we want to, transit oriented development. They're like, where? We don't have any space around our subway stops. Like we can't develop, we're already built out. And I think that's clearly a real issue. So I don't think we're gonna be prescriptive because we recognize that each neighborhood is unique, that there may be more low-hanging fruit that may not neatly fit into what we're looking at, like maybe the Century 21 site maybe doesn't fit exactly what we're talking about, but it might be the right space. I don't know, but there may be opportunities that that the community can agree on that makes sense for them, and we want to be supportive of that, and understanding that where that growth does occur, that we hopefully will solve multiple problems, which is that any new development would have a school, let's say, on the ground floor until we're right sized in terms of that if there is a physical constraint on sewer infrastructure, that reconstruction facilitates that DEP work. So if we can think about sort of how we can solve multiple problems on one site or or a few sites, I think it's a mission one. If we get some housing and we solve some problems, Brooklyn has a lot of housing. I think we have to, admit that to everyone. And so, but we do want to see if there's opportunities that development can solve for more than one problem, especially because, any changes to a built out community like Bay Ridge is going to be disruptive. And so hopefully by the end, it creates a better community than once all the construction activity it goes away.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah, Dan, Doris, and then Jenna.
Okay, well, I have a question about the Crosshopper Tunnel. But before I get to that, I want to, because we've been discussing parking and mass transit. In order to, what we need is efficient, reliable, and dependable mass transit. You know that the nicknames for the N and the R line, don't you? The never and the rarely.
Oh,
And
no.
you never heard that before?
No. Oh God.
That's a 30-year-old line.
Oh my God.
Someone went for an interview and he said I was on the R train, and they said to him, "Oh, you were on the never and the rarely."
Wow.
So that is the transit we have. And with the MTA's plan to redesign buses, they are reducing access to buses. So we need to improve and increase access and reliability in mass transit.
Absolutely. I think so. My experience with bus redesign was I was there when Jimmy Otto was doing it in Staten Island, and he was very outspoken about once they came up with their plan and they put it out there and it didn't work, he was out there being like, this is the change, this is the change, this is the change. I know you all submitted your formal recommendations to MTA, and so I think our InterGov folks saw that, and so as the BP speaks, he'll elevate those conversations with them. But I think that MTA recognizes that they're not going to get it right, and so they have previously been really open to making changes after the final version comes out. So I just want to highlight that as like, hopefully it's not like a life or death situation around this plan, because they have been shown to know that they're not going to get it right and they will make changes. So I just want to flag that. And I think part of the excitement, or part of the for IBX, is that it can connect you to other lines. And so let's say the R and the N are never there. Well, maybe the D will arrive. And so if you can get on the IBX to another line that's not the never arriving line, you might be able to get to your job. So I think hopefully, yes, we think that you have to have redundant and accessible, affordable, and convenient public transit. And that includes accessibility around the stations. If we can help solve an accessibility issue with new construction, I think that's kind of what I think. If we can align new construction that solves multiple challenges, I think hopefully we can all sort of understand the trade-offs there, not from a developer perspective, but just understanding the change of the neighborhood character, but with the infrastructure that we need.
So now getting back to my original question that was on my notes, on the Cross Harbor Tunnel, you have a very pretty picture of the Cross Harbor Tunnel, and all the traffic goes right onto the rail yard. That's not what happens. I don't know specific numbers, but a vast number of trucks that come off the Cross Harbor go onto our local streets and use non-truck routes on residential streets, and has a serious impact on Community Board 10 and Community Board 7. And we had a presentation maybe 5 years ago about expanding the Cross Harbor Tunnel. And that showed between 400 and 500 trucks going onto local streets.
Okay.
So before you need to look at the impact of the Cross Harbor Tunnel and the number of trucks that are impacting our local communities.
So,
because if the truck is going north, not east, if it's going north, it can't get onto the BQE until Hamilton Avenue.
Right. So maybe I am sort of, this is probably the least knowledgeable part of the
that's okay.
But it is rail, right? I mean, are they just coming in?
They're trailers that they bring over on a barge, and some of them go by rail east, which is a great plan, but many of them go on chassis and go onto our local streets.
Okay. So, yeah, we should stay in contact about that one.
And I will ask Josephine at some point to find that old report of the number of.
I was going to say, John, I'll give you our report. We sat through quite a few presentations, and CB10 and CB7, there may be a lot of proponents, but we had lots of concerns. So I'll definitely share that with you.
Okay, I just think that the BP's overall goal there, and maybe it's not the Cross Harbor Tunnel, but that if we can find a way to reduce the number of trucks, that's his goal.
Agreed.
We're definitely agreed there.
Agreed. But too many of those trailers do not go onto the rail yards. Rail lines. They go onto our streets.
Yes.
So
and with congestion pricing, I know that it's going to affect you probably more than anywhere else in Brooklyn, maybe in the city. We had a BQE construction. I mean, it's not easy.
Yeah.
I mean, we recently had a presentation, doesn't matter what, but how are you getting all that stuff out of Brooklyn? Well, we're going to go over the Manhattan Bridge and why not use the Verrazano? You know why? It's cheaper to use the Manhattan Bridge.
Yep. Yep. And I think they're trying to solve that with congestion pricing, but somehow the model shows that Bay Bridge gets hurt
the most. Yeah.
Crazy. But
and thank you again for an excellent presentation.
Oh, sure. Yeah, anytime.
Jana?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have lots of notes here. I think that is common in my train of thought when I'm listening to you is that a lot of these projects need huge amounts of money. And I'm very curious to see if the budget that you guys, I don't know if you said that it's still in conversation, but I'm curious to see if you guys have the capacity to do all of these projects. And then that adds also a time constraint too, because a lot of projects on these, especially with transportation, take forever. And it just seems like they take years and years. And a lot of that comes from budgeting. So is there a plan? Is there actual money for these projects? And then if not, what are the priorities within these projects? Because there's so many you have 4 main topics, but then within these topics, there's so many topics. So do you guys have priorities within those topics?
Yeah. So I think the Army Corps project is funded for New York Harbor. So that one we feel is really important to get right. And because we need investments from the federal government to help us with infrastructure. It's just, and this is the only time they're, besides Gateway, I don't think they've really invested much in the last 50 years. And so we need the money for us. And so I trying to see the forest through the trees, just that, you know, they may have some bad interventions that they're proposing right now, but that we want to get the federal money and we want to make sure that it's, you know, responsive to community. So that's one that I think is critical to get right. And that's also determinant on the Superfund funding, how that gets done. So I think keep staying at the table and making sure that frankly, that all those projects are talking together and coordinating and not delaying each other's timelines, I think is just frankly gonna unfortunately have a big impact just to keep people talking. The IBX has, like all transit projects, have skyrocketed in estimates and costs the more they look into it. There's a world where you could, you know, do some sort of tax incremental financing to actually get some value to construct here, because there are some areas that are sort of less, because there's not as close to transit, that they, you know, could theoretically increase the value to create something. But the city and state have made some funding in this way. I think the BP allocated his last whole budget to healthcare facilities. So the state, or H&H hospitals for maternal health. So investing in those maternal health wards to make it safer to have children in New York. So he has allocated his budget based on these things, and he advocates with the city and the state to invest in these kind of issues, prioritizing, you know, reconstruction of streets, making sure. So all those, we have a big budget, you know, we have $100 billion budget, and a lot of that's entitlements, but a lot of that is capital work, schools, millions of dollars. You know, we have a big school budget, and now can SCA spend the money? That's another question. But you know, we do have funding set aside for those issues. So I think, you know, New York has some money now from the feds and the state, and so that's why I'm saying we should use it. We have it. Let's use it before it dries up and goes away. Like I said, once in a generation. I just have never seen Army Corps propose something as expensive as what they're proposing for this region. So yes, we're gonna try to get every dollar for Brooklyn, of course. Don't even worry about that.
Great. Thank you. So let's see, Doris and Jana. Oh, you know, we have some members of the public. If anyone would like to ask a question, we can open it up. Now just use your hand raise function. Michael Mendito. Hi, Michael. You should be able to speak now.
Hi, Josephine. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Good to see you.
Same here.
I would like to know if the Planning Commission understands how electricity works. Do you understand, like, well, let's say if you overtax the water system, the pressure will drop. But if you overtax the electrical grid, it will crash. Do you know how a fuse works? A fuse works on current. Current is the amount of electricity. And what will happen is our electrical transmission lines will turn into a fuse and they will disintegrate and burn. So if we are already going to make every new complex run on electricity for all of their needs, and we're going to eliminate gas, we're going to, on top of that, add more development and more demand upon the electrical grid, which where I live right here, my power goes out once or twice a day sometimes because of, I don't know why. So if you're going to propose all of this new development and all these people coming in and all this extra demand, is there any plan to increase the electrical supply and the supply lines?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are so the city, the city, I think you're referring to the citywide text amendment that was just released, and I know DCP has some answers to your questions related to those issues. I'm sure they won't have all of them. Yeah, the electrical grid is going to have to be more investment needs to be made in that. We have, as electricity demand goes up, we start using peaker plants, and so we actually start pumping in dirtier electricity on high demand days. And so we're cognizant that adding more, load on the electrical grid can have, short-term sort of, we're losing power, which is terrible and can put people's lives at risk, and to long-term challenges around, long-term exposure to negative emissions. So I think, the BP is cognizant of that issue. I'm not sure if DCP will have an answer on if they have done a full electrical grid analysis on what we can and can't handle. It would, I think the ideal solution or ideal situation is that we would get some alternative energy and battery storage. There has been a lot of conversation around large scale battery storage facilities and potentially using them in spite of the peaker plants so that we save our alternative energy for later times, we reduce our emissions, but we also provide some stability in the energy grid. So I think it's probably multi-pronged strategy. I think it's a good question for DCP to answer. Have you thought about what if we move straight to EV vehicles 100% and all gas and all electric buildings, do we have the storage capacity for that? And but it's a good question, and it's a reasonable one to ask about moving to all electric.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Doris or Jana? Oh, wait, Leo Dan?
One more.
One more.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up, and I don't want to take too much time, but follow up on that conversation about the electrical grid. I think local resiliency, maybe perhaps in the form of tax incentives to local residents and owners so that they can install their own solar panel systems in their homes and battery storage, I think is something that should be kind of evaluated as well. Because a lot of the problem with electrical grid is not electrical generation is a big component, right? But it's the distribution lines ultimately that they tend to fail, especially on the summer times where everyone is cranking up their ACs and the draw really increases significantly. The substations, they have to shut down like power distribution, those areas, otherwise they blow circuits and they blow the whole lines. So I think, again, tax cost of PV panels is coming down, cost of battery storage is coming down. I done a couple of assessments for a couple of my projects, and it's not nothing, but $30,000 to $40,000 can probably cover like a single family home or at least a duplex. So, if tax incentives, not only at the federal level, but also at the city level are, more monies can be allocated towards this effort, I think that can also make it very affordable for people to start putting their own systems and having less reliance on in general. So.
Absolutely. I think I just posted in response to the all electrification question, I guess NYSERDA did a whole analysis on this. I haven't read it yet, but I just want to make sure I shared it since I found it. And looking at, how the batteries, like how we're going to incorporate these batteries, I think is a big question. But yes, major issue.
No,
And
definitely lots of questions there, and we will be looking at the citywide text amendment real soon in a couple of weeks. It'll be posted on our website. And I have to say it's growing in conversation. I recall being at Borough Hall with Con Edison saying that we have no more ability to build on our grid. Laws were passed to increase closing the doors on commercial businesses so it wouldn't escape. And our housing stock is old. And we are 90% fueled and having a diversity in fuel. And I think that certainly improving efficiency is great. Tax incentives are great, but I do think lots of very key point, very good questions, a lot of concern about going to all of one power source and what our ability is for sure. Steve, you had another question?
Hold on. You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that if in fact John did send something out on the power source, I would really like to get that myself.
Okay. I will share it out. It's in the chat and I will email it out to everyone.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Well, we have a lot to look forward to with everything on this presentation, a lot to think about and develop. The most important thing is to get that money to support everything that we talked about. And I thank you so much, Mr. Douglas, for your presentation today. I hope that we continue these conversations and have more of them so we can see a lot of these projects to fruition. I thank everyone for joining the meeting today. And I think we're at the conclusion, right, Josephine?
Yes, we are.
All right. So,
Thank you, John.
Thank you all.
Thank
Really
you
fun.
all. Have a good
Thank
night.
you, John.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Night, everyone. Thank
Thank
you.